Hello, this is the 68th lecture of Revelation and World History. Last time, we finished the lectures on chapters 1 through 10 of Revelation and World History. Out of a total of 12 lectures, we are moving toward the conclusion. We covered very important themes in the interpretation of the book of Revelation. We examined the substantive identity of the two beasts, appearing in Revelation chapter 13. We also identified the figure corresponding to the beast with two horns like a lamb, namely, 666. And the community comprising the 144,000. Furthermore, we historically substantiated the relationship between Gog and Magog and Babylon. And we looked into history to find out what kind of war the Battle of Armageddon was. In this lecture, we will examine the when is the end. Revelation and World History, Chapter 11, The Last Days and Seasons of Prophecy. Section 1, Signs of the Last Days. But about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Matthew chapter 24 verse 36. Only God knows when the last day will be. That statement is equivalent to saying, only God decides that day. However, on the other hand, all of history is proceeding exactly as it was predetermined by God's plan. Learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, know that the Son of Man is near, even at the door. Matthew chapter 24 verses 32 to 33. This means that, although we do not know the exact day and hour, people will be able to know it sufficiently by observing certain signs or historical developments when that day draws near. He will send out his angels with a great trumpet sound. Matthew chapter 24 verse 31. God said that He would announce it on that day by blowing a trumpet. Therefore, we must always be awake and listening carefully to know when the trumpet sound will be heard. Revelation and World History, Chapter 11, Section 2. The Sound of the Trumpet. The book of Revelation features scenes of 7 angels blowing trumpets several times. Let us examine the words of Revelation chapter 8. And I saw 7 angels standing before God, and they were given 7 trumpets. Revelation chapter 8 verse 2. And the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets were ready to blow them. Revelation chapter 8 verse 6. As such, before the prophecies recorded in Revelation are fulfilled, the scene of angels blowing trumpets appears first. Are fulfilled, the scene of angels blowing trumpets appears first. This signifies that, once the 7 angels begin to blow their trumpets, the predetermined histories are fulfilled in order. The key point of interpretation is what the sound of the trumpet is, and how we perceive the trumpet sound resounding from the heavens. To summarize, the fact is that the trumpet sound has already resounded, yet no one realizes it. The trumpet sound was so loud that everyone could hear it. But the people of the world did not know that it was the sound of an angel's trumpet. In the book of Revelation, we can see that, when the 7 angels blow the 7 trumpets, the predetermined history is fulfilled in order. When the history of this world is unfolding, the sound of the trumpet is not heard in that place. The trumpet sound is none other than the very news of the fulfilled historical event being made known to the people of the world. In Revelation chapter 18, the great city Babylon falls. And the sound of the city falling is recognizable by everyone in the world. Through that sound of collapse, one can recognize that the trumpet sound has indeed resounded. Following this trumpet sound, the angels carry out history in obedience to God's command. And this progression becomes the history of the fulfillment of prophecy. The fact is that, when people look at the history that has unfolded, they can tell that the trumpet call had already been sounded. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And on October 3, 1990, the divided East and West Germany were reunified. Just over a year later, the entire federation constituting the Soviet Union was dissolved. Everyone heard the sound of the Berlin Wall falling. People all over the world witnessed it vividly. However, even at that time, no one imagined that the Soviet Union would collapse. The Soviet Union collapsed just over 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thus, events such as the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union were great turning points in history that everyone on the entire globe could recognize. That sound was, in fact, a sound that anyone could hear. The statement that 7 angels will blow 7 trumpets signifies that predetermined history is unfolding. These 7 trumpets are a sound heralding that a series of historical events, beginning with the invasion of Babylon and ending with the collapse of Babylon, will proceed in sequence. Therefore, although this trumpet sound cannot be heard by the human ear, we can know that the trumpet has already sounded through the fulfillment of the prophecy recorded in the text. Furthermore, these historical events occurring today can be witnessed simultaneously by the entire world through live broadcasts. Babylon will invade many nations and rule for 70 years, Jeremiah 25 verse 12. And the core of the prophecy is that, eventually, Babylon itself will be destroyed. The Soviet Union was established by Stalin in 1922. And it was dissolved in 1991, while Gorbachev was in office. It existed for exactly 70 years before fading into the annals of history. This series of processes is the history that unfolds whenever the 7 trumpets in the book of Revelation sound. In other words, the history of prophecy fulfillment. It was said, when you hear this trumpet sound, know that the end is near. The Soviet Union, having completed its 70-year lifespan, has already vanished. Now, the last remaining thing is the end of the North Korean Kim Il-sung communist regime, established by Stalin. Knowing that time becomes our immediate task. The Soviet Union, which persecuted the Church and instilled fear of communism in the world, existed for 70 years, but has already vanished. Also, the 2 horns that ruled North Korea, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, have already died. However, in North Korea, which is ruled by Kim Il-sung's grandson Kim Jong-un, the Church has not yet been restored. Nevertheless, when the time comes, every prophecy that the dead Church will rise again will be fulfilled without exception. The final remaining historical fulfillment of the Book of Revelation and the prophetic books is the restoration of the North Korean Church. We know that time is near. Understanding that time correctly and preparing for it will be the greatest task currently facing the Korean Church. In the next lecture, we will examine Chapter 11, Section 3, There Will Be War Until the Very End. It was the Bible History School. Hello, this is the 69th lecture of Revelation and World History. Last time, we finished the lectures on chapters 1 through 10 of Revelation and World History. Out of a total of 12 lectures, we are moving toward the conclusion. We covered very important themes in the interpretation of the book of Revelation. We examined the substantive identity of the 2 beasts, appearing in Revelation chapter 13. We also identified the figure corresponding to the beast with two horns like a lamb, namely, 666. And the community comprising the 144,000. Furthermore, we historically substantiated the relationship between Gog and Magog and Babylon. And we looked into history to find out what kind of war the Battle of Armageddon was. In this lecture, we will examine that there will be war until the very end. Revelation and World History, Chapter 11, Section 3. There will be war until the end. What is the last day, recorded in the prophetic books, and when is that day? First, it must be understood that the last day, recorded in the prophetic books, does not refer to the end of humanity. This day signifies the day when the final prophecy is fulfilled, or the day when the fulfillment of the prophecy is completed. The book of Revelation encompasses the final contents of prophecy, along with the prophetic books of the Old Testament. The most central nation appearing in these prophetic books is Babylon. Jeremiah chapter 25 verse 11 clearly states that the duration of this Babylonian empire is 70 years. In the lectures of the previous chapter, we proved the fact that Babylon is the Soviet Union. The two most central nations in the interpretation of the book of Revelation appear in chapter 13. One is the beast rising from the sea, the beast with 7 heads, Revelation chapter 13 verse 1. The other is the beast rising from the earth, the beast with 2 horns like a lamb, Revelation chapter 13 verse 11. The 7 heads refer to the 7 supreme leaders of the Soviet Union. They are Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev, these 7. The Soviet Union was established by Stalin in 1922. And it was dissolved in December 1991, during Gorbachev's tenure. It existed for exactly 70 years before disappearing into history. Lenin succeeded in the Russian Revolution in 1917 and established a communist regime. He died 7 years later, in 1924. Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, was born in 1931, 7 years after Lenin's death. After ascending to the highest position of power in the Soviet Union in 1985, Gorbachev served for 7 years. On December 25, 1991, he declared the dissolution of the Soviet Union and announced the end of the Soviet Union. The number 7 is particularly emphasized in the book of Revelation. The history of the Soviet Union also contains the repetition of the number 7. After the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Lenin died 7 years later in 1924. Gorbachev was born 7 years later. And he served as the supreme leader of the Soviet Union for 7 years, and then the Soviet Union collapsed. From Lenin to Gorbachev, a total of 7 supreme leaders sat on the throne of the Soviet Union. It is a combination of numbers too peculiar to be a mere coincidence. The 2-horned beast rising from the ground is the North Korean communist regime of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. The sum of the numbers in the names of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il is 666. The lifespan of Babylon, the first beast, is clearly stated in the text of the prophetic book as 70 years. However, there is no special mention regarding the lifespan of the second beast, the North Korean communist regime. But about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Matthew chapter 24 verse 36. This means that God himself determines all days. However, one clue is given. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Matthew chapter 24 verse 34. Matthew chapter 24 is where the description of the day of fleeing to escape war is recorded. This is the Korean War that broke out on June 25, 1950. This generation refers specifically to those who experienced the Korean War or were born during that period. It does not refer to people at the time the text of Matthew was written, but rather to people who lived or were born at the time when that prophecy is fulfilled. Furthermore, separated families, separated by the division, still live in South and North Korea. It means that scheduled day will be decided before all the people born during the Korean War and their separated families pass away. And there will be war until the end, and desolation is decreed. Daniel chapter 9 verse 26. There is no basis to interpret this verse by directly connecting it to the lifespan of the Kim Il-sung regime. However, it can be explained as an example for interpreting the text. Currently, the armistice agreement that came into effect on July 27, 1953, at the end of the Korean War, remains in effect between South and North Korea. In other words, it is not a state of peace, where the war has completely ended. If we apply this to the text above, it can be interpreted as the state of war will be maintained until the North Korean communist regime comes to an end. In other words, it can be interpreted as the Kim Il-sung regime will end while the war has not ended. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be destroyed, and will no longer form a nation. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah, Isaiah chapter 7 verses 8 to 9. Ephraim and Samaria are also terms referring to the northern kingdom of Israel. If we can substitute the northern kingdom of Israel for North Korea, we can compare the above duration with the duration of the North Korean regime. We cannot yet tell whether this phrase can be linked to the lifespan of the North Korean communist regime. However, if these numbers are applied to the Kim Il-sung regime in North Korea, the following formula can be obtained. It is, Northern Israel, that is North Korea, will be destroyed within 65 years. However, the question remains, when is the starting point for establishing this 65-year period? Isaiah chapter 7 verse 2 states, Aram has formed an alliance with Ephraim. Aram was a kingdom in northern Israel that constantly harassed the Israelites. Naaman, who sought out the prophet Elisha and was cured of leprosy, was also a general of this Aramite kingdom. Even during the time of Jesus' ministry, the languages were intermingled to the extent that Jews used Aramaic alongside Hebrew. If we were to identify a modern-day nation with a relationship similar to this, we could point to China. China has continuously invaded the Korean peninsula since ancient times. In addition, the Korean script and language also contain many Sino-Korean words. Aram and Ephraim have formed an alliance, can be expressed as China and North Korea have formed an alliance. Even during the Korean War, the Chinese Communist Army joined forces with the North Korean Army and employed human wave tactics. As a result, the Korean and Allied forces retreated. However, the date on which North Korea and China officially signed a friendship treaty was July 11, 1961. North Korea and China have concluded a treaty on friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance between North Korea and China. Prior to this, on July 6, the Soviet Union and North Korea also signed a treaty of friendship, cooperation and assistance. Applying this to the verse from Isaiah chapter 7 verse 8, it reads as follows. China and North Korea have formed an alliance, but within 65 years, they will perish. 65 years after the signing of the North Korea-China Friendship Treaty in 1961 is 2026. As I write this, it is May 2026. It is difficult to predict that the North Korean Kim Jong-un regime will end within 2026. However, it is clear that 2026 will be a significant turning point in world history. The Soviet Union has dissolved. However, Russia has largely inherited its power. In fact, on February 24, 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine. And fighting continues to this day, May 2026. Furthermore, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint airstrike on Iran. As a result, ceasefire negotiations between the US and Iran are continuing with the Strait of Hormuz blockaded. Even by the time this video is uploaded, it is impossible to gauge whether a ceasefire agreement will be signed, and the situation in the Middle East will stabilize. With war continuing ceaselessly, the earth is living in an era of crisis and chaos. It is clear that, starting in 2026, global affairs will see international relations that are significantly different from the past. Tell him, be careful and be quiet, though Rezin, Aram, and the son of Remaliah are very angry. They are only two smoking stumps, do not be afraid or discouraged. Isaiah chapter 7 verse 4. The term stump refers to the root portion, remaining after the upper part of a large tree trunk has been cut off. China and North Korea are merely stumps, left behind after the Soviet Union. And the communist states of Eastern Europe have vanished. The remaining history as the fulfillment of prophecy is the end of the communist regime in North Korea. Following Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's grandson Kim Jong-un, who currently sits on the throne, continues to maintain a one-man dictatorship. The day the Kim Jong-un regime ends is precisely the day the final history of the prophecy is completed. If that happens, it is clear that the North Korean church which has been dead will naturally be revived. The writer of this text is not a prophet, but merely an interpreter who reads and interprets history. Just as it is said, neither the angels nor the Son know, we too cannot know the exact date. However, if we observe the progression of history, we can see that time is not far off. Let us read the words of Matthew chapter 24 again. Learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, know that the Son of Man is near, even at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day and hour, no one knows. Neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Matthew chapter 24 verses 32 to 36. The Soviet Union, which persecuted the church and instilled fear of communism in the world, existed for 70 years, but has already vanished. Also, the two horns that ruled North Korea, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, have already died. However, in North Korea, which is ruled by Kim Il-sung's grandson Kim Jong-un, the church has not yet been restored. Nevertheless, when the time comes, every prophecy that the dead church will rise again will be fulfilled without exception. The final remaining historical fulfillment of the Book of Revelation and the prophetic books is the restoration of the North Korean church. We know that time is near. Understanding that time correctly and preparing for it will be the greatest task currently facing the Korean church. In the next lecture, we will cover chapter 12, which corresponds to the final chapter, the conclusion. It was the Bible History School. Hello, this is the 71st lecture of Revelation and World History. Last time, we finished the lectures on chapters 1 through 11 of Revelation and World History. We have finished all 12 chapters of the lecture. We covered very important themes in the interpretation of the book of Revelation. We examined the substantive identity of the two beasts, appearing in Revelation chapter 13. We also identified the figure corresponding to the beast with two horns like a lamb, namely, 666. And the community comprising the 144,000. Furthermore, we historically substantiated the relationship between Gog and Magog and Babylon. And we looked into history to find out what kind of war the Battle of Armageddon was. Finally, in chapter 11, we presented opinions on when the final time of prophecy fulfillment will be, and what the end times are. This is the final session of Revelation and World History series. We will consider the meaning of prophecy fulfillment. Revelation and World History, Chapter 12, Conclusion and Meaning. Revelation and World History presented an interpretation by gathering only the most essential issues from the prophetic books and Revelation. In the grand flow of history, no event occurs independently or by chance. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded in Russia, and a communist regime was established. However, this event did not happen suddenly one day, and become known to the world. For major events that overturn the course of history, one must recognize that a historical current making such an event possible. In 1905 as well, there were revolutionary movements, like the Bloody Sunday incident. This incident was also likely caused by Japan's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in the previous year, 1904. However, the defeat in the war against Japan cannot be considered the sole fundamental cause of the revolution. Even before that, the livelihoods of the people were already devastated, and discontent among the Russian citizens was already high. In the midst of this, the defeat of the great Russian Empire by the newly formed Japanese Empire merely provided the initial spark for distrust in the system and the justification for revolution. The Revolution of 1917 also took place during the ongoing First World War. Russia's entry into the war resulted in the loss of countless lives, both among the people and the soldiers. In the midst of that, revolutionary forces took action, and the majority of the people responded, leading to success. It is necessary to examine whether the prophecies describe these historical trends, as well as the history of surrounding nations. Furthermore, when interpreting prophecies, simply reading these recent historical trends alone is insufficient. In 988 AD, Grand Prince Vladimir of the Kievan Rus was baptized along with his people, and declared Christianity the state religion. Russia has become a Christian nation. It is a country that maintained its identity as a Christian nation for over 900 years from that time until the Communist Revolution of 1917. We consulted Nicholas Cernob's History of the Russian Orthodox Church. However, we must understand why the Communist Revolution succeeded first in such a Christian nation. If this history is the fulfillment of a prophecy predestined by God, we must discern what God is saying and what His will is to all humanity through that history. The North Korean church was once even called the Jerusalem of the East, and a miracle of 20th century missionary history. However, it is more important to find out why they all closed their doors without leaving a single church sign behind. This means that it is not enough to simply know that the prophecy recorded in the Bible was fulfilled in such and such history. We must understand the interpretation of history and the hidden will of God, who proclaimed this prophecy through it. Here are a few topics for discussion. First, the Communist Revolution succeeded in Russia, a country with a history of the Orthodox Church, spanning nearly 1,000 years. Second, Stalin, who made a name for himself as a cruel dictator, was a former seminary student. We consulted Brenda Haugen's Stalin, the Failed Revolutionary. Third, Kim Il-sung, born into a Christian family, also destroyed all churches throughout North Korea and eradicated Christianity. After establishing a communist regime in the country, we consulted Kim Hung-soo's History of the Church in North Korea After Liberation. Fourth, however, God the Creator predestined all of this history long ago. Fifth, God proclaimed prophecies in the name of Jesus Christ through the prophets and John, and fulfilled them in this age. Sixth, then, what is God proclaiming to mankind through the fulfillment of that prophecy? Seventh, also, there are questions such as, when and how will the fulfillment of the last remaining prophecy be accomplished? There are so many matters that we need to know through the prophetic books. In addition, there is much discussion remaining regarding the central themes of eschatology, such as the millennial kingdom and the 7-year Great Tribulation. The interpretations presented in Revelation and world history constitute the most important part of the final interpretation of the prophetic books. This is so that people may know that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men, and gives them to whomever he pleases, and sets up the lowest of the low over them. Daniel 4 verse 17. If the fulfillment of prophecy is true, it is clear evidence that God is alive and working personally. The fulfillment of prophecy is the sure evidence for God, the Creator of mankind, to reveal himself to all humanity. If we are the people of the living God, we must know that we must always be awake and diligently seek the Word to understand the righteousness of God's will and the kingdom of God. If the interpretation presented in this text is not well understood, you must consider what the correct interpretation is. Furthermore, you should discuss this not only with yourself, but also with others. When looking at the future of the Korean Church and the state of the North Korean Church after unification, now is the time to discuss preparations for them. The Lord God will never do anything without revealing his secret to his servants the prophets. When the lion roars, who will not be afraid? When the Lord God speaks, who will not prophesy? Amos chapter 3 verses 7 to 8. The Soviet Union, which persecuted the church and instilled fear of communism in the world, existed for 70 years, but has already vanished. Also, the two horns that ruled North Korea, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, have already died. It conveys the lesson that empires and dictators are bound to perish. However, in North Korea, which is ruled by Kim Il-sung's grandson Kim Jong-un, the church has not yet been restored. Nevertheless, when the time comes, every prophecy that the dead church will rise again will be fulfilled without exception. The final remaining historical fulfillment of the Book of Revelation and the prophetic books is the restoration of the North Korean Church. We know that time is near. Understanding that time correctly and preparing for it will be the greatest task currently facing the Korean Church. With this, we will conclude the lectures for all 12 chapters of Revelation and world history. Thank you very much for subscribing until the end. It was the Bible History School.